Hello and welcome back to the Pain Free for Life podcast. I'm Dr. Rob Vanbergen, and today I'm joined by Dr. Aimie Apigian. Dr. Aimie is the leading medical expert on how life experiences get stored in the body and restoring the body to its best state of health through her signature model and methodology, the biology of trauma. She's a double board certified medical physician in preventative medicine and addiction medicine. She has a master's in biochemistry and a master's in public health. And in addition to her medical training, she's also a certified functional medicine physician and has training and certifications specifically in neuroautoimmunity, nutrition, and genetics for addictions, mental health, and mood and behavioral disorders. She has several certifications in various trauma therapies, including the instinctual trauma response model, somatic experiencing, and neuroaffective touch. Dr. Aimie brings you the biology of trauma, a new lens and a methodology that courageously both adds to and bridges trauma work and medicine by reverse engineering the chronic effects of trauma on the nervous system and body on a cellular level. Dr. Aimie's personal life experiences led her into trauma therapy training, first for her adopted son and then for herself. A unique lens for understanding trauma has come out of this, joining the two worlds of neuroscience and trauma therapy uniquely. It became the thread that ties it all together in a way that clinicians and patients find understandable and easily applied within their daily life. Dr. Aimie offers science-based solutions on how to rewire the nervous system with the biology of trauma, accelerating the healing journey through recovery to resilience, presence, and aliveness. Dr. Aimie is the founder and CEO of Trauma Healing Accelerated, offering her foundational online course, The 21-Day Journey to Calm Aliveness, which is an experiential journey into the nervous system that's open to all, as well as her 8-module certification course for practitioners called The Biology of Trauma, that teaches the protocols of addressing the biology of trauma on different systems of the body. In today's episode, Dr. Aimie and I discuss the difference between stress and trauma, how to recognize unresolved stored trauma, the freeze response, and the chronic freeze state, as well as the connections to biology and predisposition to trauma as a result of our biology. We also talk about the 3 key ingredients to trauma healing.
Welcome back to Pain Free for Life, where we share how to successfully overcome all kinds of chronic and extreme conditions to live happy, productive, pain-free lives forever. And now, here's your host, co-founder, and board-certified holistic healthcare practitioner, Dr. Rob Vanbergen.
Dr. Aimie, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Fun to be here again with you.
Yes, we had a great conversation last time, and I'm going to continue along the same vein just in case people haven't been able to see that interview. So I'd like to start by asking you to explain the difference between stress and trauma to the audience.
This is so good because what I find is that most people think that they're stressed, and you'll hear them say that, right? Like I'm so stressed, or they'll even call it chronic stress. And even when they go in to see their physician or healthcare practitioner, right? Like that's what they're being told. I was even diagnosed with, chronic stress and put on 2 antidepressants and told to manage my stress better. Thank you. And there's actually a very big difference between stress and trauma physiology. And most people, Dr. Rob, are actually living in a trauma physiology now, meaning that their body is living from a trauma place, not just a stress place. Now, trauma is one of the biggest causes of stress, but they are very different. And the difference is there is a line at which the body crosses when it can't do anymore. It can't take anymore. It can't process anymore. Like it's reached capacity. So if you were filling up a cup of coffee, as you near the top, you're starting to get stressed. But the moment that it starts spilling over because the cup cannot hold anymore, it just can't. Like that's the line of trauma for our body. So what does that mean? That means that in our biology, we have a stress physiology. This is actually communicated through nerves that run down our spine. So along our spine, on both sides, we have this chain of nerves that are called the sympathetic chain. And they are the ones that are responsible for our stress response. So that when there is potential danger, when there is some kind of threat, like we are able to, what I'm going to use the word mobilize. And mobilize is a fancy word for just saying like, you are going to do something. You have to take action. So those nerves bring in, communicate adrenaline so that the adrenal glands are making adrenaline. That's their first response. The whole purpose of adrenaline, the whole purpose of the stress response, Dr. Rob, is to make you move. And yet most people think that sitting and worrying about something is stress. That is not stress. If you're not moving, if you're not taking action, it's likely not stress. You're likely in trauma physiology. So what is the trauma physiology? Trauma physiology, if we were driving a car, the stress response that I just described is like having your foot down on that gas pedal and pushing it all the way down to the floor. You're going to make your car go the fastest as it can because you need to get somewhere. You need to do something, right? Like it's the action. Whereas the trauma response is inaction. This now feels so big to me that I'm going to throw on the emergency brake in my car, even though my foot may still be on the gas pedal. So I still may be releasing adrenaline. I still may be releasing cortisol. And yet the emergency brake is stronger than the gas pedal. And in our body, the trauma response is stronger than the stress response. So that the trauma response comes on in response to the sensation. And this is all monitored by our autonomic nervous system, which is collecting information from our external environment, from our internal environment. And it senses that, we're not sure we're going to make this. Like we may not be okay. And we need to shut down because we're going to run out of gas. If we sustain this speed on this road in this car, we're going to run out of gas and we may not make it at all. So we're going to throw on the emergency brake, slow things down so that we're just going to get by, but we're going to conserve our energy. And so what a person will experience in that is a feeling of my body's just kind of shutting down. My body's going into a low energy state. If we're in the stress response, this is high energy, Dr. Rob. Like this is where you are running towards the fire to save somebody or something, or you are lifting that car off of a child, or you're doing superhuman things because you actually have more energy than what you normally have. Superhuman strength. And that's why a stress response is only intended to be a temporary response because we can't sustain that high of energy, which is why in the animal kingdom, when you see a deer or antelope running for their life, that is their superhuman stress response. It's not sustainable. And so the moment, and this is fascinating to me because this is exactly what happens in humans. The moment that they sense, I'm going to run out of energy. I can't run fast enough. I can't run far enough to outrun this guy who's behind me. They shut down before they even get pounced on. The pounce is not what stops them. It's their own physiology that it informs them of everything going on, both their internal resources. And by internal resources, I mean like their actual ATP, energy, all of that, mitochondrial health, all of that. Their response is, we don't think we're going to be able to outrun this guy. So our best next survival attempt is to shut down and essentially what we say, go into a freeze response, which is almost pretend to be dead. And the value of that, and I want people to hear this because our bodies shut down and we get frustrated at our bodies, right? Like we want our bodies to perform. We need our bodies to do something and to get through our day and to get through all of our meetings and get the kids to soccer and cook the meals. Like we need our bodies to perform. And so when we see that our bodies are starting to shut down and not have energy, and we're having to drink more caffeine, or we're having to drink more soda, we're having to do something to keep our energy level up to perform, we get really frustrated with our body. And yet, here's the wisdom of the trauma response is that it numbs us. It it numbs us so that if we don't survive, and if that lion that's chasing us does eat us rather than loses interest and tries to chase another deer, and then in the meantime we can run away, we don't actually feel the pain of that collapse. We don't feel the pain as much. And so this is the value of the trauma response in us as humans, is that we carry a lot of pain. We sometimes can carry attachment pain from our childhood. We can carry the pain of rejection. We can carry the pain of all these things that we've accumulated over our lifetime. And the value of the trauma response is that we don't feel them as much. They're just a little numb. They're in the background, but I'm not having to deal with them because the chemicals that are released in the trauma response numbs us to all of that. Of course, the downside is that we kind of feel like we're going through life numb, right? And I call this kind of like, when I worked in the hospital and was a general surgery resident, we would always look at the heart monitor, right? We want to see that up and down of the heart beating. And then when the heart went flat, like that was your emergency, or, that was them finally passing. And this is how we live emotionally. We can go through life feeling emotionally flatlined. And we're not having the deep grief. We're not having the deep depression, perhaps, but we're also not having the joy. We're also not having that connection with another human being that just lights a fire inside of us and tells us, oh, I'm so happy to be alive. We're not happy to be alive. And if you want to look at like the evolutionary purpose of this freeze response, it's almost like we're living, waiting to die. We're just getting through. And so many people who come through my program, they say that as this builds over time, they eventually get to the place where they're actually waking up in a trauma physiology where they don't want to wake up. Like they don't want to get up. They don't want to start their day. They're already overwhelmed by their day. So Dr. Rob, like that is not stress, right? If that is someone in your audience who's waking up being like, oh, do I have to get up? Do I have to start my day? I just want to stay in bed. That is not stress. That's actually them waking up in the trauma response and physiology.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, there's a big distinction, obviously, between these two things. And you're right. That so many people, I think, kind of smush them together and think they are the same thing. So most of my audience are people that are struggling with chronic pain, autoimmune disorders. How would you say these sorts of trauma responses relate to chronic pain? I always kind of think people can get trauma, PTSD even, from their pain. What's been your experience with that?
So what we've come to understand is that both autoimmunity and chronic pain are the body being in a trauma physiology. Now, what came first? Was it the chronic pain that came first and then that caused the trauma physiology, or did the trauma physiology come first and that contribute to the development of chronic pain? Who cares at this point? Because they both are coexisting. And so anyone with chronic pain will recognize, oh yeah, like that's how I feel every day, right? Because it's traumatic. It is hard to live every day in chronic pain. You don't want to be awake. You want to be numb. You want to be asleep. And yet those are the trauma responses. And so it's fascinating to see that just having the chronic pain, like you say, will put a person in this trauma physiology. And so trauma work needs to be done along with the biology aspects of the chronic pain. Same with autoimmunity. And autoimmunity was actually one of the first conditions that was strongly associated with the adverse childhood experiences. And so in 1980s, Dr. Vincent Felitti, Kaiser, preventive medicine, he was told that, the biggest problem in the Western world that's causing all of these other problems in the health system is that people are overweight. So we need you to develop a prevention program that will help people lose weight. So he did this, and he, brilliant physician, developed this amazing program, helped even the people with the most amount of weight, clear obesity, lose all this weight. I mean, they were losing more than 100 pounds.
Wow.
And in a relatively short amount of time. And then he noticed that his most successful patients, Dr. Rob, were dropping out of the program, which of course made him upset, right? Like, you're ruining my numbers. As a scientist, like, we care about the numbers. You're ruining my numbers. So he thankfully got curious and started to ask them, like, what is going on? And what they told him was that, Dr. Folletti, what you think is the problem has actually been the solution to my problems. And this is what unfolded then for realizing that most of these people had clear some type of abuse during childhood. Now, of course, what we understand now of trauma and our new lens of trauma, we can see that all of them had experienced moments of feeling overwhelmed, that shutdown, that low energy. And this is what starts what I call a biology of trauma. And it is happening underneath the surface, Dr. Rob, so that most people don't even realize that their immune system has been traumatized, that their immune system has PTSD, that their digestive system has PTSD. And there's so much stuff that we hold in our gut. And from what we understand of autoimmunity now, there is so much that the gut plays in the role of developing autoimmunity. Yes. And so all of this is happening underneath the surface. And it wasn't until I had my health crash, 2014. I'm a third-year general surgery resident. I go in and all of my autoimmune markers are off of the charts. And we don't have any explanation for it. And what they told me, Dr. Rob, was seriously, well, when you wake up with that butterfly rash or pain and arthritis type in your joints, come back, we'll diagnose you, we'll give you a formal diagnosis, and then we'll be able to start, our protocols. And I'm like, isn't there anything that I can do to not get that rash? Like, I don't want to go down this path. And they said, no. So I know. You and I can laugh about that now, because thankfully I searched and I did my research and I found functional medicine. And now that's why I'm a functional medicine practitioner, and seeing the role that trauma and this new lens of trauma, that it's not the big events in our life. It's just these moments, life experiences of feeling alone and overwhelmed. And that's what starts this process of the immune system getting PTSD and the digestive system getting PTSD. And it's slowly building over the years. And my goal is to be able to help people identify that earlier on, like me, earlier on, before the diagnosis comes, so that we don't have to go down that far, but we can recognize, like, there's actually this biology of trauma that becomes autoimmunity, sometimes over decades, but it's been building for that many years. It's not something that just happens. It's been building, and the basis of it is this biology of trauma.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, people that are listening may be thinking still, I don't think I can't think of anything traumatic I've ever been through, I have a high stress life. That's just how it is. And I've got no other way around. I got to put up with it. So how would someone go about recognizing if they did have unresolved stored trauma in their body?
Well, if they are questioning that, they are just like me, because I actually adopted Miguel when he was 4 from the foster care system. And I was a foster parent first and then adopted him. And when I looked at his life, clearly there was trauma. And so then when I looked at my childhood, I was like, there was no trauma. There's no trauma. Now, I know that we're not supposed to compare, but I think that we normally compare, right? And so especially having my son to compare to, I was convinced that there was no trauma. One of my recent podcast episodes on my Biology of Trauma podcast, I interviewed one of my mentors in my community. She's a Chicago policewoman, Dr. Rob. And she was like, trauma? No, I haven't had any trauma. And I'm like, excuse me?
I got to laugh at that just from what I can imagine they go through every day and see.
Thank you. Right. And so I think that that's part of the point, is that other people can recognize, like, wow, that must have been really hard to go through. And yet we went through it. And so we're like, trauma? No. Mm-hmm. Maybe that was a stress. So I think naturally we have a hard time recognizing our own trauma. And that's why I've really come up with this definition of trauma, that it is anything that for any reason at that time overwhelmed our ability to respond and stay in movement.
Mm.
Because then you can look at, well, what about that time that you got really sick? What about that time that you broke a bone and were in a cast? What about that time, right? Because those then became those for any reason, for whatever reason, overwhelmed us. And so when we look at trauma through that lens, then we can see, well, this is how someone would recognize it. In their life today, do they have thoughts of, this is just too much. I can't do this anymore. When they get home from work, or maybe just going throughout their day, do they find themselves looking for things to do mindlessly?
Mm.
They don't want to be fully present. They may not even know what being fully present means. They are used to numbing, maybe with alcohol, and maybe they're reaching for that glass of wine in the evenings just to take the edge off, just to be able to relax. Or maybe they're doing some emotional eating when they don't want to feel lonely, when they don't want to feel grief, when they don't want to feel, right? And that is the trauma response right there, is that we just don't want to feel. And so much of the things that we look for to do mindlessly, those are actually just reasons to check out and not be fully present in our lives. And we live so much in our heads and not actually feeling our body. And so anything that we're doing, if we notice that we are doing things to not feel certain ways, that's actually trauma patterns. And what about the body sensation? So does your body feel energized, right? Like, do you feel calm and yet alive? Do you feel stressed and you're taking action? Or do you feel this sense of, what's the point? My body feels heavy. I have to push my body throughout the day. This is where, again, like I'm sometimes even creating stress, or I'm drinking caffeine, or I'm doing things to give me energy because my body just feels heavy. And this is where some people, Dr. Rob, when they go to relax, relaxing is not relaxing for them. Like it doesn't actually, they don't enjoy relaxation because it brings up all of this stuff, right? Like they start actually feeling their body. They start feeling how tired and exhausted they actually are. And so we stay busy. We multitask. Oh my goodness, how we multitask in order to just not feel how tired our bodies are. So that is one way to recognize that, like we constantly have this trauma response. It's just, I call it, it's like it's waiting for us, right? It's calling our name. And we're like, no, I'm going to multitask. I'm going to drink more caffeine. I'm going to stay busy. I'm going to stay stressed to try to stay out of this tiredness and this exhaustion, this slump. Of course, this would also be any form of shame. So if you're criticizing yourself, if you're noticing that you're in that self-talk of criticizing yourself, shaming yourself, that's all trauma response. That's actually not stress response. And then, like you mentioned, there are certain conditions that are strongly associated with this trauma response. Chronic pain, autoimmunity, chronic fatigue. Those would be the big ones that a lot of people deal with and don't realize that those are actual conditions that have a biology of trauma. And so again, whichever one came first, but at this point, that coexists with this trauma response. And so we get to do that work and recognize that trauma coexists with those conditions.
So you've got these it seems like there's such a broad spectrum of people that could be experiencing trauma. But, just putting in my head here, like if we were to have someone that's really busy all the time, right? So they've constantly got to do all of these things. And then they find themselves easily overwhelmed. So these people are like, okay, I've got to do all this all the time. As you said, it's a way of coping. And then something goes wrong and they crash. That's a trauma kind of response in itself, but it's not the only way of looking at it.
No, it's not the only way. And I like how you are really emphasizing the fact that it doesn't need to be an event, right? Mm-hmm. Like the trauma response does not need to be an event that we're not looking for these big events that happened in our life. The trauma response for a lot of people, a lot of adults, is happening on a daily basis. It's just part of how we live every life. And what I see is this kind of pattern of going back and forth between I'm stressed. Okay, now I'm overwhelmed. I'm stressed. Okay, now I'm overwhelmed. And that can go back and forth every single day. So that again, every day our body is having this foot on the gas and now emergency brake, foot on the gas and now emergency brake. And imagine what that's doing inside to our physiology. It's very confusing because our mitochondria are like, okay, what am I supposed to do right now? Okay, I'm supposed to rev up the engines. I'm supposed to go, go, go right now. Whoa, now I'm shutting down. The emergency brake came on. And now we're going again. Like it's just, it creates so much havoc on our biology, creates so much oxidative stress, creates so many toxin buildups because it actually shuts down our detoxification pathways. Like it just wreaks so much havoc on our biology that this is what leads to so many of these conditions. But yet we're not, again, if we're looking for a big event in our life, we're going to miss the fact that no, just every day, like our everyday life has now almost become a habit of just going into the trauma response because we go into overwhelm without realizing that overwhelm is the trauma response. It's not the stress response.
Right. Wow. Okay. So at the beginning, you were talking about this concept of being chased by an animal and, that when that animal's caught, like eventually it gives up and it freezes if it knows it's doomed. So this freeze response is something that people go into as well. And I've seen patients in chronic pain kind of fall into this pattern as well. But how would someone, because I don't think it's quite as evident as people picture the freeze response and they think you're just paralyzed and frozen, right? But it's not that evident. So how would you describe the freeze response and how would people know whether they're living in kind of like a chronic freeze state? Because they're not, in most cases, they're probably not just laying there on the couch, unable to move 24/7, right?
Not at all. And we have this terminology, the freeze response. And so people can think of like fight, flight, or freeze. And freeze means that I just stand there paralyzed. No, actually. And inside with our trauma response, there is that moment of we realize like, oh, I'm not strong enough. I'm not big enough. I'm not good enough. Whatever that is, I'm not enough for this big threat that just popped into my life. And so oftentimes we can feel the drain of our energy, or we can feel a knife in our gut. Like we're going to feel some body sensation. And in that moment, we have a decision to make, and our unconscious autonomic nervous system makes that decision. And it's almost like we cut that part off and we say, okay, you're obviously incompetent to do anything. So you go over there and we're going to still pretend that we're okay. And I can think back on times in my life when I felt that internal panic, but then complete like, oh my goodness, like I can't believe this is happening and I don't even know what to do. And yet on the surface, I probably didn't appear any different, right? Like I still went through the motions. I still put on my fake smile. All is good. All is good. And it wasn't until then that I was alone that I would feel the full collapse of what had happened in that moment. And so we do have this ability to cut off parts of us. And this is what then develops into a chronic freeze state where there are these parts of us, there are these elements in our body where it's like we disconnect our mind from our body. And we are like, okay, body, you're confused, you're overwhelmed, you don't know what to do. And so we try to figure things out with our brain without the help and support and alignment of our body. Now, of course, that can only go so far because we need our body to cooperate in the process. But that's also where it further promotes the disease because our body is now fully in this shutdown mode and all of what comes with that with the biology. And yet our brain is almost ignoring it.
Right.
And we talk about suppressing emotions and we talk about repressing emotions. Both of those become very toxic. And that's what then develops into this chronic freeze because we never do that repair. We never actually give the body what it needs to come out of that experience and process what happened. This is what I see many times happen with people who experience a big grief. In the busyness of our lives, they don't allow themselves to actually feel the full grief. They've got work, they've got family, they've got responsibilities. They don't have time. We don't have time, Dr. Rob. We don't have time. So again, it's going back into that place of, let me push my body to perform. And in the process, I'm almost blocking it off. I'm suppressing it. I'm numbing it. I'm having to find ways to not feel my body. And that is exactly what becomes then this chronic state. We are living chronically in this state of this trauma response underneath that we're trying to suppress and just get through life.
Yeah, it's hard to think about that there's that many. There's loads of people out there that do that push everything down, right? And I think it's part of the human condition. It's almost what we have accepted as the normal, especially in Western world. Yeah. We're not allowed to display emotions, right? And I think it goes both ways. You see a lot of time, like gender-wise, men will say, well, I've got to be strong. And they'll, either bottle it all up or push it to the side. And women push it all aside because they're often the caregivers too, right? And the caregiver role has to be one of the most stressful roles that anyone can ever perform. And people that do this for like their aging parents, and they give up 20 years of their life plus sometimes trying to make other people comfortable. And nothing's about you anymore. How can that not be traumatic to your body, right? It's mind-blowing. It really is.
If anyone ever has remembered having the thought of, I don't even remember who I am anymore, that your body has been living in a chronic freeze or trauma response. Kind of like that sense of, who am I? And when did this become my life, right? These are all evidence that we haven't actually been fully present. We've just been doing, go, and not actually being present for what's happening in my life. I see this a lot in people who try to remember their childhood, Dr. Rob. And they're like, oh, yeah, no, it's funny. It's funny, right? It's funny because I just don't remember much. And I'm like, because you weren't present. Mm-hmm. You were... it wasn't safe to be present. You were already in this mode of maybe needing to be perfect, needing to be somebody else, needing to do. I don't know what it was for you, but you clearly weren't actually present.
Yeah.
And when we're not present, that is evidence of the trauma response.
Yeah, it's just
back it can go.
Yeah, it goes back so far. And you're right. Like, I think about things from my childhood too. I remember getting diagnosed with hepatitis, which I contracted from food. And part of like, I had 6 months of being sick before I started to get over it. And I remember my teacher would put me in the broom closet when I was in pain. And I used to laugh about it. I think, oh, that was so funny that she'd put me in there because I was disturbing the other children. But now I think back on it, I'm like, that probably was not cool at the time, and that should not have happened. But she put a little chair in there, and I would get put in the broom closet, and that would be that. So it's this interesting to kind of look at these things, like these memories that we kind of think, oh yeah, that's funny, and we can laugh about it now, but it can't have been making you feel safe or comfortable, or there's so much underlying stuff we got to look at for sure. Yeah.
Well, and that's why I feel like this new definition of trauma, that anything being put in a broom room, anything for any reason at that time in our life, because we can look back at things now with our perspective and be like, oh, well, I can see I have a different perspective. But at that time, we didn't have a different perspective. And so we're not looking at our life from our current perspective. We're needing to look at our life at that time through our understanding of the world and ourselves at that time. Was I even mature enough to understand and process what was happening? So trauma is anything that for any reason at that time overwhelmed us, overwhelmed our ability to understand, to process, and and to respond.
Right. Well, and some people appear to be more predisposed to trauma, right? So that's got to be a biological thing on a cellular genetic level. What sort of things can predispose people to experiencing trauma on maybe a heightened scale or just more frequently?
Yeah, and let me just first say that no, trauma is not genetic. So we're not gonna go do a DNA test and say, oh, like you are gonna experience more trauma, you're gonna be diagnosed with PTSD. But there are so many biological factors that most of them are actually more epigenetic than genetic, but there are even different exposures that we can have in our lifetime. But it's really anything that is going to affect the sensitivity and reactivity of our nervous system at that time.
Mm.
So that if you are a more sensitive child, for example, you are going to experience your family and your family dynamics very different than maybe your sibling who doesn't have that same sensitivity. So that the two of you grew up in the same family and you're looking back and going through the memory bank and being like, that's not how I remember things. Like, no, it wasn't that way because we experienced it different based on our biology. And so we can have, for example, different biochemical imbalances. And there are three most common biochemical imbalances that I am finding in people who have this trauma response, and it makes them more predisposed to trauma. One would be methylation imbalances, and more of society is shifting to an undermethylation status, which not all of them, but many of them have lower serotonin and dopamine activity levels. Well, if you have less serotonin and dopamine activity, you're just going to be experiencing life as harder, right? Like serotonin is your happy neurotransmitter. And if you don't have as much of that, or dopamine is your joy and motivation. So if you don't have as much of that, like your experiences of life are going to be very different than someone who has a healthy activity level of serotonin and dopamine. Then we have copper excess, zinc deficiency, pyroluria. These are things that if you have those are literally making your nervous system, so your autonomic nervous system, way more sensitive and reactive. So that even being around a group of people for you would be overwhelming if you have these. And yet for someone else, like they're like, no, this is fun. This is great. This is a party. When can we do this again? And yet you're walking away feeling so overwhelmed that, again, anything for any reason at that time overwhelmed us. That ended up being a repetitive trauma because you're being exposed to all of this sensory information, and including people or sunlight or different types of light or loud noises that for your system, it's just way more sensitive and reactive. And so then there's this long list then of, well, these are all the things that we need to look at. But it's true that our biology can actually make us a more sensitive and reactive system and experience more trauma as a result.
It's interesting you mentioned this siblings thing. I think about I have these conversations with my brother and sister all the time. And it's like, they're like, no, that didn't happen that way. I'm like, yeah, it did. That's exactly how it was. And it's funny, what they remember as a negative experience, I can remember as a positive experience. Right. So it's fascinating that sort of thing can be changed, and everything is for them in that, like, well, a dark and gloomy kind of dark and stormy night moment. And for me, it's like, that was the best time ever. So yeah, we have to be aware of that then. So that these different factors, and these are things that are just going on within our body that we can't necessarily easily change, but by being aware of them, we can know that we are more likely to potentially view things in a different lens that could be potentially harmful in the end.
Yeah, and there's a lot that we can do to support our biology once we understand what are those pieces that are affecting my autonomic nervous system, its sensitivity, its reactivity. And so setting me up, there's so much that we can do. And so there's a lot of hope. And I feel that this brings in more tools for what has generally just been kind of left in the hands of therapists or psychiatrists or psychologists, where we're still just mostly working with the brain. And it's like, oh, this opens up a whole new set of tools, which for me brings in a lot more hope for what is possible in the future.
Absolutely. And speaking of hope, let's talk about some things that we could potentially do to work on trauma healing. So I believe you have three kind of key ingredients that you normally go to try and start people working towards resolving their trauma. Could you share what those are?
Yes, and this kind of comes from my accumulation of experiences, not my personal experiences, my son, myself, working now with thousands of people, being an addiction medicine physician and having trainings in trauma therapy. And I've kind of taken all of that and been like, what am I seeing as the pattern, or what are the essential pieces? There's lots that is helpful, but are there essential things that a person has to have in order to have the most healing that they are able to accomplish? And for me, that comes down to somatic work, parts work, and biology work. And so somatic work for me refers to really working with the body. And I've been trained in somatic experiencing, neuroaffective touch. So those are my main modalities that I use for somatic work. It's not just breath work. It's not just some of these things. Like it's a different way of connecting with our body where it allows our body to actually guide the process. So rather than my mind still controlling my body by telling it how to breathe, it's a different way where we're doing a bottom-up approach and I'm able to connect and put my mind's attention on my body and let it experience things in a safe and supported way. So that's why I start people with a 21-day journey. And in that process, we've seen significant changes in their biology, in their GI symptoms, in their sleep issues, in their depression, in their anxiety, as a result of just somatic work using these modalities. And then there's parts work. And parts work refers to, I was kind of mentioning parts, parts that get cut off or parts that get frozen. And there's these different parts of us that we hide. And so parts become this aspect of the narrative, the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves. And as long as we continue to tell ourselves that, oh, this is just the way I am, I'm unlovable, this is just the way I am, I'm a perfectionist, this is just the way I am. As long as we tell ourselves those things, we're going to continue in the same patterns. And so that is a necessary thing to gently look at and question. Like, are these really true? And do that in order to be able to change the habit of just, well, this is just always what I do because this is just who I am. And then we need to work on the biology. And we've done some good conversations around that, even here around, as long as you have this biology that's setting you up, like predisposing you to trauma, you are going to be experiencing trauma. I don't care how much other work you do, like your biology is set for that trauma response. And we've talked about the chronic pain and autoimmunity as being some of the downstream effects of this trauma response.
Yeah.
And what happens is that trauma response creates these changes in our biology, and those changes in our biology feed back on the cycle to keep it stuck in the trauma response. And so that's why we have to address the biology as well. We can't just talk about something. We can't just do somatic work, or we can't just do these other pieces. We do need to address the biology that's now keeping us stuck in a trauma response.
Okay, perfect. Well, that's some good starting points and good to know. So obviously, I'm going to include all of your information in the podcast show notes so people will be able to connect with you there. So thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Aimie.
Thank you, Dr. Rob.
So until next time, everyone, I'm Dr. Rob Vanbergen, and you're listening to Pain Free for Life.
Thanks for listening to Pain Free for Life. Be sure to follow us, share the show with family and friends, and leave us a review on iTunes. Every time you share the show, you are helping someone take their life back from pain. Visit painfreeforlife.com for more resources, including our free guides to microcurrent, the Hache protocol and inflammation, as well as our blog and online community full of people just like you, successfully overcoming all kinds of chronic and extreme conditions to live happy, productive, pain-free lives forever. And stay tuned for the next episode of Pain Free for Life.